Yeah. I'm Dr. Gray Brecken. I'm the project founder and scholar of the Living New Deal, which is based here at the Geography Department at UC Berkeley. And I started the project about 10 years ago it was going to be a book. I was looking for a project that was a bit more upbeat than the kind of environmental writing that I was doing about California. And so with a photographer, I headed out looking for WPA projects around California that we could photograph and then I'd write about. And several things immediately came up. One is that most of them are unmarked. Another is that there were a lot of other agencies I'd never heard of before that built things and left them. And the final thing is that it's not all written down somewhere. The records are very incomplete. And so what we began to discover is that it couldn't possibly go between the covers of a book, and also that there was so much. We were actually uncovering a lost civilization that my parents' generation built but forgot to tell us about. Because what they talked about was the misery of the Depression. They didn't talk about the hope of it and the kind of inspired leadership and the things that they were building and left us, and which we couldn't do without at this point. So what we really discovered is that, as I said, it wouldn't go between the covers of a book, but we were now living in the 21st century, and it was ideal for an interactive website that could constantly be expanded and that also other people could add to, because we needed help. It morphed from being a me project to a we project, which is totally appropriate to the subject, the New Deal, because it was communitarian, profoundly communitarian, because that's the way that the Roosevelt administration saw the only way that we could get out of the multiple crises of the Depression, the Dust Bowl, other environmental crises we were in at that time, and eventually the war, too. It's profoundly communitarian, which is very different from the kind of world that we live in today. So I think I'll toss to Alex, because Alex is much more tech proficient than I am. I'm still back in the 20th century.
If not 19. My name's Alex Tarr. I'm a graduate student here in the Geography Department at UC Berkeley. I'm finishing up hopefully this year. I'm also the project manager for the Living New Deal project. And I actually joined the project 6 years ago as a research assistant, and a lot of what I was doing was looking for WPA New Deal sites in Southern California. We had documented, by the time I joined, a lot of the documentation had happened up here in the Bay Area, in parts of the Northern California, the Central Valley, and we were just starting to really look at Southern California, what was there. And then I went off and did my own research and writing projects and came back about 6 months ago to be the project manager here. And a lot of what I do is keep the website up and running, though we have a separate design team that does a lot of the sort of very complicated technical sides of the project. And I can talk a little bit more in a minute about sort of keeping track of all of the different types of publics that we engage with on a day-to-day basis. Everything from sort of professional scholars of the New Deal and California history who engage with the project, to amateur historians, to kind of general public. And I think we'll get back to this, but a lot of thinking about how do we engage with other forms of public education. So putting together curriculum for high school, middle school, grade school teachers, for college classes, and really looking for ways to engage with all different segments of the public with kind of the history of the New Deal. And as Gray was starting to touch on, some of the ideological concepts of what the New Deal is about, particularly with regards to the arts, history, culture, those kinds of humanities dimensions of the project.
Because really, one of the things, I mean, it started out as a search for physical objects. I mean, I'm fascinated personally with the public arts projects, which were so big during the New Deal when the government sponsored artists of all kinds, writers, painters, sculptors, actors, really, and musicians too as well. But they left a great legacy behind. So I'm interested in the physical objects, almost like an archaeologist. But I think what we've all become fascinated with is the values that are embodied in those objects. They're often very beautiful, but there's a kind of lost ethical language also embodied in those objects that I think really inspires people when they begin to learn how to understand that language. It's so different from the world we've come to take for granted, which is kind of a day-to-day savagery. They had an idea that they were going to create a civilization worthy of the name. These were, many of the people in the New Deal had really gotten their start working in settlement houses, or they were involved with Jewish social justice or the social gospel movement. And so they were deeply compassionate as well as ingenious. And this is, I think, the thing that I've discovered and that I think really inspires people who get involved in the project.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I can talk a little bit more, too, about the specifics of some of those things, which is, I mean, as Gray mentioned, at least when I started on the project, I was kind of like, well, you know, where's the index? Where's the archive where you go to and there's the list of everything that
We all do.
the WPA built in California? And for a number of reasons, it's not there. There was, it's pre-computers, there wasn't, as we were saying, record keeping, sort of the right-wing march from the day the New Deal started to the present has really erased a lot of things that were reported. And also the programs are really about putting people to work and restoring their dignity. So there wasn't the same kind of sense of needing to report back to the federal government all the time. It was just as long as people were working and conditions were improving, that was sort of enough. So one of the results of that is there are all these things around us that, I mean, I have been looking at every day of my life in California and not seen as sort of New Deal legacy things. And then there are things that are hidden away. And sort of one of my favorite examples is inside of Bakersfield High School.
Yeah.
Is this beautiful mural that students see all the time, but unless you're a student there or one of the teachers, you wouldn't necessarily see.
It's wood inlay.
Yeah. And so what we're able to do with the New Deal, the Living New Deal project, is take pictures of that, find as much of the history as we can, and then make sort of an entry for it in our database, and then put it on the map. So if you go to the Living New Deal website, you'll see we have sort of different ways of accessing the database, but a lot of it is through kind of categories, so arts projects versus infrastructure projects, and then a lot of what people really do is explore the map, and right now it's built on Google Maps, it's interactive, and you can sort of go to a specific area, or you can search for a specific kind of project, and find different things that were built by various New Deal agencies. And in California, that a lot of it is WPA, especially the arts programming. And then the other thing we've been very interested in is looking at what the CCC built, which was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which did a lot of the work in rural areas in California. And one of the things that I've been excited about with this project is I'm very much an urban scholar, but sort of looking at how much the New Deal is not discriminatory across spaces. That it sort of touched every part of every life in every part of the state. So there are huge, obviously, clusters in San Francisco and Los Angeles, but every small town, if you look at the map, has a New Deal post office, has a beautiful school. Firehouses, libraries,
and sewers,
and paved roads, and a lot of the sort of the kind of beautiful recreational areas in California that kind of make the state famous and sort of inspire all these other things. You know, trails were put in,
roads were paved.
I'm blanking on the word. Just like public restrooms were put into parks and that kind of thing.
Convenience stations.
Yeah.
They call them.
So kind of, it's the stuff that around us that kind of makes this, that we take for granted now. So in that kind of big idea of the project, really engaging people with a different notion of what the public is. And sort of both historically that the New Deal engendered sort of a new concept of the public, and I mean, you can talk a little bit more about this, sort of an expanded notion of who the public is, what the public should have access to, from the arts to health and everything sort of in between. And then sort of a modern sort of rethinking of what the public means and kind of taking our database and saying, we really want this to be a, well-researched, legitimate, useful scholarly project. Something that serious New Deal scholars can come and look at, find primary sources they wouldn't have access to otherwise. And at the same time, saying that resource should be publicly accessible. You shouldn't have to have a PhD or be getting a PhD or be at a university to have access to this information. And at the same time, as Gray talked about right at the beginning of this, we're very interested in a sort of public-sourced project. The scope of the New Deal and the scope of, even just in California, was so grand that the two of us and the rest of us sort of small team could spend the rest of 10 lifetimes trying to find everything.
We'll never get to the bottom of it.
Right. And people know all sorts of things about their town or their neighborhood or their school and send us stuff. And a lot of that comes from Gray and other members of our research team going out, giving presentations at local historical societies, going to schools and giving talks. And we're, one of the things we're doing with the grant from you all is doing a series of public salons around the state. So what will happen at those, and we're very excited about this, is either Gray or Harvey Smith, who's another research scholar with the project, will partner with either the Park Service or the Huntington or some sort of other kind of publicly oriented venue and give small talks about kind of the legacy of the New Deal that we know about in that area. Because we sort of, we know pieces everywhere now. But at the same time, really solicit engagement from the public that's there, whether that's retired amateur historians to undergraduate interested in this period of history to art history students. This semester we're working with our history professor. So it really becomes this kind of back and forth in the development of the project. And I'll say one last thing and I'll turn it back over to Gray.
Sure.
One of the things that's been really interesting is just sort of the very simple act of putting someone's entry onto a map becomes such a much more immediate and engaging public process. Sort of a lot of the work I do, I interviewed somebody in 2008, and maybe in 3 years my book will come out, and they can go, yeah, I was, that was me. I contributed to that, and this is, in a matter of days, we can go from, I found this amazing mural inside of my library that I never knew was there, and now the whole world knows about it, and it suddenly connects to all these other things. So one of the great things about doing this as a sort of online relational database is we can say, here's a sculpture in a public place in Los Angeles, and here are 12 other sculptures around the state that were done at the same time that kind of connect sort of thematically across the state. So it's a way for people to kind of get out of their very isolated kind of, this is my little thing. Like, oh yeah, we were part of a much bigger project, both in the sense of the New Deal and the Living New Deal.
And one of the great things about the Living New Deal is that it's fun. It engages people. Everybody likes to do a treasure hunt. And this is like a huge treasure hunt where everybody knows something, or if they start getting involved in it, they go, I never knew that this stuff was here. I got in touch with a local historian in Nevada City, for example, and I said, well, what did they do up there in Nevada City in Grass Valley? And he said, I don't know, but I'll go into the newspapers and find out. And then I went up and talked to him a few months later, and he gave me a stack of clippings that he had found, that he had Xeroxed off of the microfilm that was about 1 inch thick. And we spent the afternoon walking around Nevada City, and he was showing me all this stuff, and he said, I never knew they did this. And I said, don't worry, Steve, nobody does. So it's fun. It's exciting. I love to talk to retirement communities because and we've got to do this quickly because most of the people who are involved in the New Deal in one way or another are now in their 80s or 90s. So we've got to get them quickly. And they've all got memories. And when you talk to them about this period, it jogs their memory, and they start remembering things they've forgotten about. And we love to capture those memories. We're working with the Regional Oral History Office, the Bancroft Library, to try to capture some of these people who are still with us. And so that's really a lot of fun. I guess that's the point of it. As a geographers, we like to show people the landscape that they've taken for granted and teach them how to see it in a very different way. It's like reading a text, but finding that it's deeper and richer than you ever could have imagined. And this is one way to see it. To see what was once possible in an economic environment that basically we think of as terribly depressing, because it was so hopeless in a lot of ways. And I found that it was in some ways quite the opposite because of this inspired and compassionate leadership and the fact that so many people were given socially beneficial jobs that the market just does not provide, and that it left us so much stuff. The final thing is that we hope eventually in the long term to create the nation's first museum and memorial to the people who did this. If you go to Washington, you'll see that the city is completely filled with memorials to war, military action. There is no monument to the people, and there were millions of them, who served in the CCC, the WPA, the PWA, the FSA, all these agencies. They're not commemorated anywhere. They've been completely forgotten. And so we want to have a museum and memorial that will also be kind of a study center so that people remember those compassionate values that are embodied in all these works that we're finding. And as Alex said, we've scarcely begun to scratch what the CCC did, because so much of what they did was involved in soil conservation, river restoration, forest planting. That stuff is hard to photograph, and yet it's out there. They did also build beautiful stonework and lodges that we see in our parks, of course, and that's easy to photograph. But much of the work that the CCC did was very important, and it's just really invisible.
I just want to jump off of something that Gray was saying a moment ago that reminded me of one of the questions, which is part of what's exciting about the project, and that people do get so excited and engage with it, is from an academic standpoint, it's really easy to be an interdisciplinary project. Mm-hmm. And I mean, both Gray and I are trained in geography, which is already sort of an interdisciplinary discipline. But it's really easy to go out and talk to historians and artists and art historians and economists, and immediately kind of click and have people go, oh yeah, I totally see the value of this project, how it could contribute, why I might use it. And it's in that regard, it's sort of been an interesting. I worked on a lot of other interdisciplinary projects around digital media before, and there's always a kind of like, well, how do I don't quite get it, and for this has sort of hit that sweet spot of everybody we've worked with, whether they're faculty or they're students, have kind of found a place to contribute something. It's big enough but not so big that people kind of get lost in the mix. So we have sort of a core team here in Berkeley, just because of the history of the project, which has really been Gray and then Richard Walker, who's emeritus in the department, who have sort of kept the project going over the years. Paul Groth, who you've been communicating with, is also in the department and really sort of a cultural landscape expert, and really has been the person who could help us find. But he's one of those people who just sort of knows how to look at like water records and find that piece that you knew was there but couldn't find. And Robin Einhorn in the history department is on our board. So we have sort of an academic advisory board.
Robert Reich.
And
Christina Romer.
And then a fair number of community people who we've known through various capacities got involved at different times. So a lot of our communications and outreach is handled by a woman named Susan Ives, who's also helped a lot with our fundraising, and has been critical to kind of keeping the project going, because it's the kind of stuff that we don't necessarily do on our own very well. Even Harvey Smith, who is a Renaissance man, I don't know if you want to say.
He's a retired school teacher here in Berkeley who's also the president of the National New Deal Preservation Association, which is a national organization. And Harvey's just the go-to guy. I mean, we sort of came up with the idea of this inventory together, and Harvey's always traveling around the country, photographing stuff and talking with people. So he's been very, very useful.
Could you guys talk a little bit about, just because since you mentioned him, you had mentioned earlier that you know, the kind of connections with school children and pedagogy, you know, whether it was at the high school or elementary school level, you know, just strikes me as something important to think about, especially as Gray, you had mentioned the kind of learning the appreciation almost of the everyday object, right? Whether it's the sewer system or something like that, the really intense beauty in these pieces. Do you have relationships with various schools around this project?
At the moment, we're not having like direct relationships with specific schools. We've had school teachers around the state and around the country submit curriculum to us that they have built over the years around the New Deal, so we can kind of become a clearinghouse for those things. And we've updated them a little bit ourselves. And at various times in the past, not currently, we've worked with LA Unified School District's Arts Education Branch around sort of helping them look through their collection. They have a huge amount of New Deal stuff, but also asking exactly that kind of question of how do students look around them and really kind of ask, where did these things come from? Why is this school like this? Why are my streets like this? And really, I mean, well, I'll say two different things. So one is the kind of the treasure hunt aspect. So teaching students enough kind of the New Deal history that they start to really look for it everywhere. And things like, I mean, schools are an obvious place, but I think about
and the schools often have artworks in them.
Right. Doing things like looking for WPA stamps in the sidewalk, which is one of our favorite little projects. But all these sidewalks are put in at WPA, and there's still stamps there. So it becomes this kind of very active type of looking. And even if people aren't finding New Deal things, students are asking questions about, you know, where does this space come from? And you know, aesthetically, what makes it certain ways or the other. And then the other thing is using the project itself just as a sort of research resource for, high school students and college students mostly. You know, being able to sort of point students to the website and say, research an artist, see what types of work they were doing. Look at the and it can sort of be a jumping off point. So even if a student got interested in something like the WPA theater program, we have resources around what other parts of the arts branch of the WPA were really doing in California, for example. And I'll sort of, does that kind of get at what you're...
Well, I got another thing. You know, today, because we've got such a high unemployment rate, especially with African Americans and Hispanics, it's much higher than the general rate, and we don't really have many programs to deal with that. Well, you had the same situation during the Depression, and Eleanor Roosevelt at one point said that when she thought about how we were losing an entire generation of young people, it sometimes just terrified her. And it should terrify us, because what it results in is obviously despair, crime. We have to build massive prison systems because we're pulling the money out of our schools. They put money in schools because they felt that it was much cheaper and better for society to lift people up through public education than punish them. We're doing exactly the opposite. So what we have now are all these sort of social pathologies that we take for granted. The New Deal dealt with it in a very different way. And there is one person, at least that I know of, who's also trying to deal with that, Van Jones, who founded a group called Green for All. And that is to really show people, well, to create jobs for inner city kids. And so Van, a few years ago, had Harvey Smith and me basically spend the day giving a bus tour for inner city kids, largely from Oakland, of New Deal sites in San Francisco and Oakland. And we started out, and these kids were really jaded. You know, they were just so bored with it all, and they just couldn't have cared less. By the end of the day, these kids were so turned on by what they saw because they began to understand that there was a time where we actually had solutions to problems that they're very familiar with. That there were not only jobs, but in fact they left beautiful things, art objects. Because a lot of these kids are probably graffiti taggers and artists as well too. Well, there would have been jobs for them at that time. And one of the things that I find so impressive by talking to the older people who were in the CCC, for example, is the pride that they still feel for what they built at that time. They will take their families to see the buildings, the stone walls that they built. They will run their hands along them and say, I did this, you know, because they're still so beautiful. Well, we have to have programs like that today. And I think that these kids begin to understand that there was a time when their problems were dealt with in very ingenious, creative, and compassionate ways. And that's a possibility that they haven't been told is available to them at all. So that's one thing I'd like to see a lot more of. I know that the young people in the California Conservation Corps, which Jerry Brown set up in his first administration, inspired by the original Civilian Conservation Corps, those kids get a grounding in what the original CCC was about. And they come out of that often with a real pride in the kind of hard work that they do and the kind of on-job training that they get in it. We need to have more like that.
I just want to jump in with sort of going the future vision part of this very quickly, because then I'm going to have to run. I mean, one of the things we're most excited about now is we've been growing really fast. So both the site, we just keep adding more and more stuff. We get more and more submissions. We actually have a huge backlog now, especially a woman named Barbara Bernstein donated this huge art registry to us, so we've just been trying to even get that input, and it's kind of it's like critical mass now. We sort of we grow and grow and grow, and the more we're out there, the more we get submitted. So one of the things we're going to be able to do now with the UCHRI grant is sort of come back to California and really start putting together a more curated parts of the site, because when we sort of had, you know, a couple hundred entries, it was easy enough for anybody to kind of go through and play around and find stuff. And now we're sort of getting to a point where people like Gray or myself really need to take the things that are in our head that we know, and we're not going to write books, but to really create pages on the site that navigate visitors through the collection a little bit. So in the same way that a museum might be curating their collection, or like a tourism guide would be taking people through a space, we're going to start doing that on our site, and we'll start with places in California and really say, you know, here is the you know, the post office tour, you know, so someone can really go through and look at the different types of murals that were done in post offices in Southern California, for example. And that, I think, then will dovetail a lot with how we're thinking about curriculum and creating a space then that isn't necessarily for people to submit new projects, but to have a bit of a conversation about what's already there. So really starting to build out something more like a forums around the entries on the site, so that researchers, we could do something specifically for students to come and sort of say, wow, you know, like I was looking at this and it reminds me of this, you know, what I was doing over here, or and sort of really kind of helping people connect the sort of living history to the landscape, to contemporary sort of culture and politics, and sort of making that a much more kind of vibrant conversation. And then very quickly, the last part of it then is also building out the bibliography. So there's huge pieces of scholarship that were done over the last 75 years that are in small journals, they're in newspapers, they're in dissertations that were written in 1960.
Well, we found that dissertations actually begin on the New Deal almost from its beginning. 34 and 35, they're starting to write dissertations because they knew something very different was happening.
Yeah, actually, Clark Kerr's dissertation,
That's right,
is very much about, sort of ends with the New Deal. But sort of finding a way of making that resource much more dynamic. We sort of have an internal bibliography, but the next step is to make that sort of a much more active project using Zotero, and being able to share that sort of as a public resource.
And one of our associates actually compiled a filmography of New Deal films, not only films about the New Deal, but also films that were done by the agencies that are probably back in the National Archives. And we hope to have a New Deal Film Festival here at Berkeley and perhaps down in Los Angeles as well, to show people some of these amazing films about, for example, what the CCC was doing in Mono County, for example.
I just want to say one last thing, and then see if you have any questions. The other piece of this that we just haven't talked about at all is it's been a fairly technically difficult project to work on. We've had a pretty impressive team of web developers over the years. The department, fortunately, has our own servers here at Berkeley that we're allowed to use, so we're not dealing with complicated private hosting, but there are all sorts of complications that come with hosting something at a public university. So, a huge amount of time goes into kind of the technical sides of this, and it's really been sort of the joy and the pain of doing a digital public humanities project. Is you're like, this is all great, and then suddenly the map isn't updating. So there's like 1,000 entries that suddenly aren't on the map, and we all have to kind of scramble and go, why is that happening? Where is it? And I think it's the part of the project that we're perpetually surprised by, because we have this sort of traditional scholarship mindset where you write your book, it's published, it's done, you go on to the next thing. And with the website, we meant for it to be growing, but there's kind of this idea like, well, you build the website and then you just kind of add data to it, and it's never gotten to that state, because there's always something, we want to add a feature here, we want to change the way a certain feature over there, we thought would work a certain way and it doesn't. So all those things are kind of always developing and always take more money and more resources. And just the basic day-to-day maintenance can be really challenging. On the other hand, at the end of it, you get this, I think, really cool website that is a way of sharing a whole set of history that otherwise is just totally disconnected and not out there. Sorry, do you have any last questions before I run?
I know that you've got to go, so I wanted to thank you both for your time. It's been really interesting to hear all of the details of the project. I think it's really exciting. And hearing a little bit about the challenges, too. I'm sure that others are in your shoes who are doing these kinds of really big projects, both big in terms of numbers of people and what you're working on, and then the kind of the digital interface as well, which is, like you say, no small feat.